In the quiet suburban neighborhood of Maryland, 2012, Maria Jenkins had always been known as the perfect wife and mother. She was dedicated to her husband, Richard, and their 2 children, giving everything to build a stable, loving home. But behind the pristine exterior of their family life, Maria had been harboring a painful secret. Her husband was cheating. She had known about the affair for months, and while she once considered forgiving him for the sake of their children, it was becoming impossible. Richard was unrepentant, and Maria was about to put an end to it, publicly. Maria Jenkins had always been the type of woman who believed in the strength of family. Growing up in a small town, she had watched her parents' marriage survive the ups and downs of life, and she wanted the same for herself. Her mother, a soft-spoken yet resilient woman, had once told her that love wasn't just about the good times, but about staying together through the storms. Those words had shaped Maria's understanding of marriage, and for the longest time, she had clung to that belief, even when things began to unravel in her own life. She met Richard in the late 90s, right after graduating from college. He was charming, ambitious, and promised her a life filled with love and adventure. For years, it seemed like that promise was being fulfilled. They bought a home in Maryland, had 2 beautiful children, and built a life that Maria cherished. She became a stay-at-home mother, devoting her time to their children, Sophie and Liam, while Richard worked long hours to provide for them. Maria saw herself as the foundation of their family, holding everything together so that their children could grow up in a safe, nurturing environment. But over time, things changed. By the time 2011 came around, Maria noticed subtle shifts in Richard's behavior. He seemed more distracted, and there were times when he would come home late, smelling faintly of a perfume that wasn't hers. At first, she tried to ignore it, brushing it off as the stress of his job, or maybe just her overactive imagination. After all, Richard had never given her any reason to doubt his loyalty. He was a good father to their kids, and while their marriage wasn't perfect, Maria thought they were solid. But then the signs became harder to ignore. He was spending more time on his phone, keeping it close to him like a secret. When they went to bed, he would often turn away from her, scrolling through messages late into the night. Their conversations had grown strained, more surface level than they had ever been. The intimacy that had once flowed so naturally between them had withered, replaced by a cold distance Maria couldn't quite explain. It was on January 5th, 2012, that everything changed. Maria had been doing the usual household chores, trying to keep her mind off the nagging feeling that something was wrong. As she sorted through the mail, she noticed a credit card bill that was much higher than normal. Curiosity tugged at her, and against her better judgment, she decided to look through the statements. That was when she found them, the hotel receipts. Her hands trembled as she scanned the charges. They weren't just for one night. There were multiple transactions over the course of the last few months, all at the same hotel, a place Richard had no reason to be. The reality of what was happening slowly began to sink in, but Maria didn't act immediately. She knew she needed more than a gut feeling or some suspicious charges to confront him. In the following weeks, Maria began quietly investigating. She checked his phone when he was asleep, careful not to leave any trace of her searches. She found messages, ones that confirmed what she had feared. Richard was seeing another woman. The pain hit her like a tidal wave, but still, she didn't confront him. Instead, she began collecting evidence. Photos of him leaving their house at odd hours, conversations between him and the woman, even a few times when he slipped up and left work early. By the time February came around, Maria had more than enough proof, but the thought of destroying their family kept her silent a little longer. She still loved Richard, or at least the version of him she had once known. She didn't want to break up their home, and part of her hoped that maybe, just maybe, he would come to his senses and realize what he was doing before it was too late. On February 15th, after weeks of sleepless nights and growing frustration, Maria finally decided to confront him. The kids had gone to bed, and the house was quiet, the only sound being the faint hum of the heater as it pushed warmth through the vents. Maria's heart pounded in her chest as she approached Richard, who was sitting in the living room, oblivious to what was coming. She had rehearsed the conversation in her head 1,000 times, but when she opened her mouth to speak, the words tumbled out awkwardly. Richard's reaction was everything she feared. At first, he denied it. He claimed she was overreacting, that there was nothing going on, and that he had been working late or meeting with clients. But when Maria laid out the evidence she had gathered, there was no escaping the truth. He broke down and begged for forgiveness, blaming stress at work, blaming the pressures of life. Maria, though hurt, felt a flicker of hope that maybe this was the wake-up call he needed. But things only got worse. In the weeks that followed, Richard's attitude shifted. Instead of working to repair their marriage, he became cold and defensive. When Maria brought it up again, hoping for some sign of remorse, he turned the tables, accusing her of pushing him away. He blamed her for being too focused on the kids, for not giving him enough attention. By the third confrontation, it was clear Richard wasn't sorry. He wasn't going to stop. And now, he was making Maria feel like she was the problem. For weeks, Maria battled with herself. She couldn't sleep, her mind constantly replaying the arguments, the betrayal, and the future of her children. Sophie and Liam were her world, and she didn't want to break up their family. But every time she looked at Richard, she saw the lies, the deceit, and the lack of remorse. The breaking point came on March 3rd. Maria had been at the grocery store, running errands like any normal day. But when she came home, Sophie ran up to her, asking about something strange she had seen earlier. While Maria was away, Richard had brought another woman, Lisa, into their home. Sophie, just 6 years old, had seen them in the living room, sitting too close, hugging. The innocence of the question broke Maria's heart. Her daughter didn't understand what was happening, but the image was enough to shatter any hope Maria had of saving her marriage. This was no longer about a mistake. Richard had crossed a line, bringing his affair into their home, into the lives of their children. That night, as Maria lay awake in bed, she realized that the only way forward was to make a plan. She would gather every piece of evidence she could, and when the time was right, she would expose him for who he truly was. There would be no more second chances. This was the beginning of the end for Richard Jenkins. By early March, Maria Jenkins had reached the point of no return. The betrayal she had once tried to forgive had now evolved into something deeper, an unshakable resolve to reclaim her life. For years, she had sacrificed everything to build a home, a family, and a life she thought was safe. But Richard, the man she once trusted, had turned that life into a lie. He no longer just hurt her. He had disrespected their home, and worst of all, brought his betrayal into their children's lives. That was something Maria could not forgive. On the night of March 6th, as Richard left for another business trip, Maria sat quietly at the kitchen table. Her hands gripped her coffee cup as her thoughts swirled. She no longer cried. She had shed all the tears she could. Now she was clear-headed, determined. She had made up her mind to gather undeniable proof that would not only expose Richard, but ensure he would lose everything. Her mind was already set on the upcoming family reunion, a yearly event that would bring everyone together. That would be the perfect stage to reveal the truth. Maria's plan was methodical. She purchased hidden cameras online, small enough to be disguised as ordinary objects. One camera was carefully tucked into a decorative clock on the bedroom dresser, another placed within a photo frame in the living room. She made sure the angles were perfect, capturing everything without drawing attention. There would be no risk of discovery. Every moment Richard and Lisa spent in their home together would be recorded. In addition to the cameras, Maria discreetly placed a voice recorder in Richard's briefcase, one that would activate with sound, picking up every whispered conversation, every incriminating phone call. She knew his routine well by now. Richard was careless, thinking Maria had grown tired of confronting him. He believed her silence meant she had accepted his infidelity. He couldn't have been more wrong. Over the following weeks, Maria distanced herself emotionally from Richard. She stopped trying to engage him in conversation and spent more time with the children. She made herself scarce, giving him the freedom to carry on his affair without interruption. Her absence fueled his arrogance, and with each passing day, Richard grew bolder in his behavior. Maria watched silently as he brought Lisa into their home again and again, thinking no one would ever find out. But every time they entered the house, the cameras captured it all, every touch, every word. Maria had a growing collection of video footage and audio recordings that painted the picture of a man who had not only betrayed his wife, but shattered the very foundation of their marriage. She felt a deep sadness, but at the same time, a sense of clarity. She would expose him, not for revenge, but for her children and for herself. She could not let them grow up in a home built on lies. As June approached, plans for the Jenkins family reunion were in full swing. Richard's parents had been hosting the event every year at their large estate on the outskirts of Maryland, and this year was no exception. The reunion was set for July 4th, a day filled with barbecues, games, and family traditions. Everyone would be there. Richard's siblings, their spouses, cousins, nieces, and nephews. It was a time to reconnect, to celebrate family history, and for Richard, a chance to present himself as the successful man with the perfect family. But Maria saw it differently. She saw it as her opportunity to expose the truth in front of the people who mattered most to Richard. She played along with the preparations, keeping up appearances as the devoted wife, but inside she was preparing for something far bigger. By now, her collection of evidence was complete. She had hours of footage, voice recordings, and even text messages from Richard's phone, all pointing to his affair with Lisa. There would be no room for denial. Maria decided that the family reunion would be the place where everything would come to light. She had stayed silent for long enough. She had gathered enough proof to ensure that when the truth came out, there would be no doubt left in anyone's mind. She would not only expose Richard's betrayal, but make sure he felt the full weight of his actions in front of the people who thought they knew him best. The morning of July 4th was bright and warm, with the scent of fresh-cut grass filling the air. Richard's parents' estate was the perfect setting for the reunion. A sprawling backyard, with tall oak trees providing shade, picnic tables set up for the feast, and children running around in excitement. Maria arrived with Richard and the kids, keeping her expression neutral, even though her heart raced with anticipation. She had already prepared the USB drive containing a carefully edited compilation of the videos and recordings she had collected over the past few months. The day unfolded as expected, with laughter, shared stories, and the smell of barbecue wafting through the air. Richard played the role of the doting father and successful businessman, mingling with his family, unaware that the clock was ticking on his facade. Maria stayed close to their children, watching everything from the sidelines, her mind calm and focused. She had to time this perfectly. As the sun began to set and the family gathered indoors for their traditional slideshow, Maria knew the moment had arrived. The living room was filled with Richard's relatives, everyone settled comfortably in their seats, ready to watch the yearly compilation of family memories. Maria felt her pulse quicken, but maintained her composure. She stood quietly in the back as Richard's father set up the projector and connected the laptop to the screen. As soon as the room was darkened and all eyes were on the screen, Maria made her move. She approached the laptop under the guise of adjusting the settings and quietly slipped her USB drive into the port. She navigated through the files quickly, ensuring no one noticed the switch. Then, with a steady hand, she pressed play. She had crafted this plan so carefully, waiting for the perfect moment. And now, surrounded by Richard's entire family, there would be no escape. The room grew quiet as the projector clicked on. The familiar whirring of the machine filled the space, and all eyes turned toward the screen. Richard's father, always the organizer of the reunion, smiled and nodded toward Maria, thinking she had prepared something special for the family, a tribute perhaps. But what played on the screen was not the happy, smiling family moments everyone expected. Instead, the grainy footage flickered to life, and the room fell into a stunned silence. On the screen, Richard appeared, clear enough for everyone to recognize, but he wasn't alone. Lisa was there, her presence unmistakable. The footage, though not perfect in quality, showed them together in the intimacy of their home. Richard had believed he was safe, but Maria had captured every detail, the tender touches, the stolen kisses, the whispered words. The silence in the room became suffocating. At first, no one could fully comprehend what they were watching. The images on the screen shattered the carefully constructed image Richard had built over the years. There was a collective gasp, and the whispers began. Faces that had been filled with admiration now twisted in confusion and shock. Richard, frozen in his seat, turned pale. The weight of what was happening crashed down on him like a tidal wave. He tried to stand, but his legs felt weak beneath him. He shot a panicked glance toward Maria, realizing too late that he had underestimated her. He had believed she would stay quiet, that her love for the children and her desire for a stable family would keep her silent forever. But Maria had found her voice, and now there was no stopping what she had set in motion. As the footage continued, Richard leapt from his chair, rushing toward the laptop in a desperate attempt to stop the video. But Maria had positioned herself between him and the screen. She stood firm, blocking him, her eyes cold and unyielding. She didn't need to speak. Her presence was enough to let him know that this was far from over. The footage played on, transitioning to the audio recordings she had meticulously collected. The room filled with the sound of Richard's voice, sweet-talking Lisa, making promises, completely unaware that every word was being recorded. The weight of his actions hit him harder with every passing second. He had thought he could control everything, but Maria had outplayed him in every way. The atmosphere in the room shifted from shock to disgust. Richard's family, once his greatest supporters, now looked at him with disbelief and shame. His parents sat rigid, unable to speak, unable to even look at their son. His siblings exchanged glances, trying to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the one exposed on the screen. James, Richard's eldest brother, stood up as Richard lunged at Maria in a fit of rage, trying to silence her. But James was quicker, stepping in to hold Richard back. Even in his anger, Richard could not escape the growing sense that everything was falling apart. Maria's calmness was unnerving. She had anticipated every reaction, every possible outcome, and she remained steady, even as Richard's world crumbled around him. When the last recording ended and the silence returned to the room, Maria reached into her bag. With the same steady hand, she pulled out the divorce papers. She had prepared them weeks ago, knowing this moment would come. Without a word, she threw them at Richard's feet. Her terms were clear. She would take full custody of the children, and Richard would lose half of everything they had built together. There was no negotiation, no room for him to argue. The evidence was irrefutable, and now there was no turning back. The next few weeks became a nightmare for Richard. The consequences of his actions began to unravel faster than he could grasp. Maria, armed with undeniable evidence, moved swiftly through the legal process. In court, Richard's attempts to fight for custody were weak and ineffective. He had no defense. The judge, presented with hours of footage and audio recordings, had no choice but to side with Maria. On August 15th, 2012, the court awarded Maria full custody of the children. Richard would lose half of their assets, and he was ordered to pay monthly child support. The judge was firm, warning him that any missed payment would result in jail time. His life, once so stable and respected, had completely fallen apart. As the weeks went by, Richard's position in the family crumbled as well. His parents, once his greatest allies, could no longer look at him the same way. His siblings distanced themselves, ashamed of the scandal that had rocked their family. Richard, once a man who had everything, was now isolated and alone. For Maria, though the process had been painful, there was a sense of relief. She had spent years being the perfect wife, sacrificing her own happiness for the sake of their family. But now she was free. Free from the lies, the deception, and the constant heartbreak. She moved forward, focusing on her children and building a new life for them. Richard, on the other hand, spiraled into self-destruction. The affair had cost him everything: his family, his reputation, and his dignity. Every month, as he paid the court-ordered child support, he was reminded of the moment he lost it all. His bitterness consumed him, and he struggled to find a way back to the life he once had. But Maria had moved on. Surrounded by her children and the support of her community, she found strength in the very people Richard had disregarded. Though the scars of the past would remain, Maria had reclaimed her life. She no longer needed to be the perfect wife. She was finally free to be herself. Richard, left alone to live with the consequences of his choices, would forever be haunted by the memories of the day. His lies were exposed for the world to see. What had been a perfect facade of family unity turned into a scandal that would haunt Richard forever. The reunion would be remembered not for celebration, but for betrayal and the devastating consequences of one man's unfaithfulness. And for Maria, though the pain still lingered, she emerged stronger, free from the chains of a loveless marriage, and finally ready to reclaim her life.